The space vessel Vanguard moved through the darkness between stars like a small fish in an endless ocean. Captain Henry Brooks sat in his command chair and watched the navigation screens with calm eyes that had seen many years of service. He was 72 years old with gray hair and a face marked by time and experience. Most men his age would be retired and living quiet lives on Earth, but Henry had been called back for one more mission because he knew how to talk to alien species better than most younger officers. The crew of 12 people worked at their stations in comfortable silence. They were on a simple diplomatic mission to meet with colony representatives in the outer territories. Nothing dangerous was expected. Nothing exciting was supposed to happen. Henry had done missions like this hundreds of times before. Then the alarms started screaming. Lieutenant Danny Price looked up from his sensor console with wide eyes. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke because he was young, and this was his first real emergency. The sensors showed 6 warships dropping out of hyperspace directly in front of them. They were Zethrain vessels, and their weapon systems were already charging. Henry moved fast despite his age. He ordered the shields up and tried to change course, but the Zethrain ships were faster and better armed. The first energy beam hit the bow. Vanguard and the entire ship shook like a toy being rattled by an angry child. Lights flickered and sparks flew from damaged circuits. Another blast hit them and the weapon systems went offline before they could even fire back. Henry knew they had lost before the fight really began. He grabbed the communication system and ordered all crew to the escape pods. His voice was steady and calm because panic would only get people killed. The crew moved quickly through the corridors toward the small pods that could carry them to safety. Danny hesitated at his station and looked back at Henry. The captain waved him away with a firm gesture. Henry stayed in his chair and watched the screens to make sure every pod launched successfully. He counted them in his head as each one separated from the dying ship. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. Everyone was safe except him. Only then did Henry move to the last escape pod. He climbed inside and sealed the door and launched himself into space. But the Zethrain had been waiting for exactly this moment. A blue beam of energy wrapped around his pod like a giant hand grabbing a ball. The tractor beam pulled him toward the largest enemy ship, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Henry sat back in the pod seat and closed his eyes for a moment. He had been captured before during the old colony wars, and he had survived then. He would survive this too. The Zethrain pulled his pod into their cargo bay, and armed soldiers in heavy armor surrounded him as soon as the door opened. They put restraints on his wrists and led him through corridors of strange alien metal. The Zethrain ship jumped to hyperspace and traveled for what felt like days. Henry was kept in a small cell with no windows and only a hard bench to sit on. Guards brought him food that tasted like cardboard, but he ate it anyway to keep his strength up. He did exercises in the tiny space to stay alert. He thought about his crew and hoped they had been rescued by now. Finally, the ship stopped and Henry was pulled from his cell. The Zethrain took him to a shuttle that carried him down to a planet's surface. Through the small window he could see a massive city of towers and domes that stretched as far as the eye could see. This was Nexus Prime, the capital world of the Galactic Council. The council chambers were designed to make visitors feel small and unimportant. The room was vast with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. 12 platforms rose up around the edges, and each one held a different alien species. They sat high above the floor looking down at where prisoners stood in the center. Bright light shined down on that center spot like a stage while the council members sat in comfortable darkness. Henry was pushed forward to stand in that circle of light. He kept his back straight and his face calm even though his heart was beating faster than normal. His hands were still locked in restraints behind his back, but he stood with dignity. The largest platform held Chancellor Vex of the Krill Collective. He looked like a giant insect with multiple eyes and clicking mandibles. His voice came from a translator device that turned his alien sounds into words Henry could understand. The Chancellor began speaking in a tone that dripped with contempt. Henry listened as Vex explained that humanity had violated Council law by establishing colonies in territories the Council claimed. The penalty for this crime was subjugation. Earth would become a protectorate, which was a fancy word for slave world. Humans would lose their freedom, and their resources would be harvested for the Council's benefit. An armada of 200 warships was already on its way to Earth to enforce this decision. The other council members joined in with their own comments. Admiral Zorn of the Zethrain laughed at Henry's age and appearance. General Kutar of the Sarix called humans primitive children playing with technology they barely understood. Others made jokes about human weakness and ignorance. They seemed to think this was all very entertaining. Henry stood silent through all of it. He watched them with those old eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by pompous displays. The council mistook his silence for fear or shock. They thought he was too scared to speak or too defeated to argue. Admiral Zorn even made a comment about how the old man must be trembling inside. That was when Henry decided he had heard enough. His voice cut through their laughter like a knife through paper. It was not loud, but it carried across the chamber with absolute clarity. Every word was measured and deliberate. He told them they had made a mistake. They looked at him and saw an old man with gray hair and a limp from an old injury. They thought that made him weak. But they did not understand what it meant that humanity sent their elders to handle important matters. Humans did not put their old people away to be forgotten. They put them in positions where experience and wisdom mattered more than physical strength. Henry explained that he had 60 years of experience in warfare that the council could not imagine. He had fought in battles and commanded ships since before most of their current officers were born. He had seen peace and war and everything in between, and he knew exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed into a corner. The chamber went quiet. Even Chancellor Vex stopped talking. They had expected begging or tears or desperate negotiations. They had not expected this calm declaration from someone who should have been terrified. Henry looked up at each council member in turn, and his next words would echo across the galaxy for years to come. His voice was quiet but filled with absolute certainty. He told them that if they wanted war, then humanity would give them war. Not the kind of war they were used to with rules and honor and careful maneuvering. Real war. Human war. The kind of war that came from a species that had clawed its way up from primitive survivors to spacefaring civilization, through countless conflicts and disasters. Chancellor Vex recovered from his shock and his mandibles clicked in anger. He ordered the guards to take Henry to the prison complex. The old captain was dragged away through massive doors, but he never looked back at the council. He had delivered his message, and now events would unfold as they would. The prison complex was supposedly the most secure facility in the galaxy. It had held prisoners from 1,000 different species over 10,000 years of council history. Force fields and thick walls and endless guards made escape supposedly impossible. Henry was put in a small cube of a cell on level 42 of Section 7. The walls glowed with a faint energy field, and cameras watched his every move. But Henry was not worried. He sat on the hard bench and began counting in his head. He calculated travel times and distances. His crew had escaped and would have reported what happened. Earth would know where he was because the council had broadcast his trial across all their channels as propaganda, and Earth would respond. He knew his people. He knew his military. He knew that right now plans were being made and ships were being prepared. The council thought they had won by capturing him and sentencing Earth to slavery. They thought their overwhelming numbers and superior technology made victory certain. They had broadcast their intentions and their armada's departure as a show of strength, meant to terrify humanity into surrender. But they had actually made a fatal error. They had given Earth a target and a timeline and a reason to unleash everything humans were capable of. They had poked a sleeping bear and called it weak. Now they would learn what happened when you threatened the survival of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters for millions of years. Henry smiled slightly in his cell. The council had wanted to humiliate him and terrify his species. Instead, they had just guaranteed their own defeat. Because humanity now knew exactly where their captain was being held, and exactly where the council leadership gathered, and exactly how long they had before that armada reached Earth. And knowing all that, Henry was certain of one thing. His people were coming for him, and they were bringing hell with them. Fleet Admiral Patricia Cole watched the broadcast from her office in Geneva and felt her blood turn cold. The video showed Henry standing in chains before the Galactic Council, while they mocked him and laughed at humanity. She had served with Henry 30 years ago during the colony wars and knew him better than most people. When he spoke those final words about giving them war, Patricia understood immediately that it was not a threat to the Council, but a message to Earth. Henry was telling them to hit back hard and fast. He was telling them not to hesitate or negotiate or show weakness. He was giving them permission to do whatever was necessary to win. Patricia stood up from her desk and walked to the window overlooking the city. Somewhere up in orbit, the defense satellites were already tracking the Council armada that had been sent toward Earth. 200 warships against everything humanity could gather. The odds were terrible, but humanity had faced terrible odds before. She activated her communication console and sent out emergency Zhao codes to every military leader on Earth and in the colonies. Within an hour, the Defense Council assembled in the secure chamber beneath headquarters. President Graham Hayes arrived first, followed by General Marcus Webb, who commanded the Space Marines. Director Lisa Monroe from Earth Intelligence came last, carrying data files that contained everything they knew about Council military capabilities. The meeting started without any pleasantries or small talk. President Hayes asked for a situation report, and Patricia laid out the facts in clear, simple terms. The Council had declared war by attacking the Vanguard and taking Henry prisoner. An armada was heading toward Earth with orders to force humanity into subjugation. They had approximately 2 weeks before those ships arrived at Earth orbit. The question was not whether to fight, but how to fight in a way that humanity could actually win. General Webb spoke first, and his voice carried the rough edge of a man who had spent his life in combat. He wanted to mobilize every ship and every soldier humanity had. 50 colonies scattered across space would send their vessels to Earth for the defense. The United Earth Fleet currently had ships spread across dozens of systems, but the recall order would bring them all home. It would take time, but they could assemble a significant force. Patricia agreed, but added that conventional warfare would not be enough. The Council had superior numbers and their technology was more advanced in many areas. Humanity needed advantages that the enemy would not expect. She turned to Lisa Monroe and asked what intelligence had learned about Council military tactics and weaknesses. Lisa opened her data files and began explaining what her agents had discovered over the past 10 years of careful observation. The Council fought wars according to strict traditions that valued honor and proper conduct. They used precise energy weapons designed for surgical strikes against military targets. Their ships maneuvered in formation and followed established patterns that had worked for thousands of years. Most importantly, they believed their way of fighting was superior to all others and never adapted to unexpected tactics. This gave humanity several advantages despite having fewer ships and older technology. First, human vessels were faster because engineers had developed quantum slip drives that cut travel time by 40% compared to Council engines. Second, human weapons were crude but devastating because they relied on kinetic force and mass rather than elegant energy beams. Railguns could fire solid projectiles at incredible speeds, and missiles could overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers. Third, humanity had never agreed to ban nuclear weapons in space combat like the Council had done thousands of years ago. But the biggest advantage was how humans fought. Humanity had learned warfare in mud and blood over thousands of years of history. Survival mattered more than honor. Victory mattered more than following rules. When humans went to war, they did whatever it took to win because losing meant extinction, and humanity had nearly gone extinct several times already. Patricia outlined a 3-phase plan that would use all these advantages. Phase 1 was rescue. A small team would infiltrate Nexus Prime and extract Henry while the Council was distracted by their armada heading toward Earth. Phase 2 was defense. The main fleet would intercept the Council armada before it reached Earth and hold them off at a strategic choke point. Phase 3 was retaliation. Once the Council saw that humanity would not surrender easily, strike teams would hit their military installations across Council space to make continuing the war too costly. President Hayes listened to the entire plan and then asked the hardest question. How many people would die if they followed this course? Patricia did not lie or sugarcoat the answer. Thousands would die in the fleet battle alone. Maybe tens of thousands. The rescue mission was extremely dangerous and might fail. The retaliation strikes would put Special Forces soldiers in enemy territory, with little hope of support if things went wrong. But if they did nothing, then humanity would lose its freedom and become slaves to the Council. Some costs had to be paid. The president nodded slowly and looked around at each person in the room. Then he gave the order to proceed with all 3 phases. General Webb left immediately to begin mobilizing the Space Marines. Lisa Monroe departed to brief the Special Operations teams. Patricia stayed behind with the president for a moment. Hayes asked her if she really thought they could win this war. Patricia answered honestly that she did not know. The odds were against them, and the Council had thousands of years of experience. But she also knew that humanity had one thing the Council did not have. Humans were stubborn survivors who refused to give up even when defeat seemed certain. They had climbed out of caves to reach the stars, and nobody was going to push them back down. Within hours, a strike team assembled at the lunar base. Commander Jake Sullivan led a group of 20 elite soldiers who specialized in impossible missions. Lieutenant Amy Harper was an expert in demolitions and could build bombs from almost anything. Sergeant Chris Bailey had trained in close combat for 15 years and could disable opponents twice his size. Dr. Helen Cruz spoke 17 alien languages and understood xenobiology better than anyone else in the fleet. They boarded a stealth vessel called Shadow that was coated in special materials to absorb sensor scans. Their mission parameters were simple: reach Nexus Prime without being detected, break into the most secure prison in the galaxy, extract Henry Brooks, escape before the entire Council military came down on them. Jake briefed his team during the flight, and nobody complained about how dangerous it sounded. They all volunteered, knowing the risks. Meanwhile, Patricia took personal command of the defense fleet. 57 warships gathered in Earth orbit over the next few days. The flagship Defiant was a heavy cruiser with enough firepower to take on ships twice its size. Surrounding it were destroyers and frigates and support vessels. Every crew knew they were heading into a fight where they would be outnumbered almost 4-1. Every crew chose to go anyway. Patricia stood on the bridge of the Defiant and addressed the entire fleet through communication channels. She told them that Earth was depending on them. Millions of humans across 50 colonies were depending on them. Captain Henry Brooks, who was sitting in an enemy prison cell, was depending on them. The Council thought humanity was weak and primitive and would surrender without a real fight. It was time to prove them wrong. The fleet departed Earth orbit in formation and began the 2-week journey to intercept the Council armada. They traveled to a place called Arcturus Junction, where multiple hyperspace lanes converged into a natural choke point. If they could hold that position, then the Council ships would have to fight their way through instead of just bypassing to reach Earth. It was the perfect place for an ambush. President Hayes addressed the people of Earth in a broadcast that reached every home and colony. He did not lie about the situation. Humanity was facing a war against an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. The enemy had more ships and better technology and thousands of years of experience. But humans had faced extinction before, from ice ages and diseases and natural disasters and wars among themselves. They were still here. They were survivors. Hayes explained that Captain Brooks had been captured and the Council demanded Earth's surrender. But humanity would not surrender. Humanity would fight for its freedom and its right to exist as an independent species. The fleet was already moving to intercept the enemy. Strike teams were preparing to hit back at Council military targets. Earth itself was mobilizing every defense it had. Whatever happened next, humanity would face it standing on its feet rather than kneeling. On Nexus Prime, Henry sat in his cell and counted the hours. He had calculated the travel times based on what he knew about human ship capabilities. The rescue team would arrive in approximately 73 hours if they left immediately after seeing the broadcast. The defense fleet would engage the Council armada in approximately 312 hours. Everything depended on timing and coordination and a little bit of luck. Henry used his time productively by studying his captors. The Zethrain guards followed predictable patrol patterns that repeated every 4 hours. The Shadow dropped out of quantum slip drive at the edge of the Nexus Prime system and hid among the floating rocks of an ancient asteroid belt. Commander Jake Sullivan studied the holographic display showing the massive planet below, surrounded by defensive satellites and patrol ships. Getting past all that security, to reach the surface seemed impossible, but Jake had built a career doing impossible things. Dr. Helen Cruz worked at her console, searching through billions of electromagnetic signals coming from the planet. Every person on Nexus Prime carried identification chips and communication devices that created a constant noise of data. Hidden within that noise was one specific signal that Helen needed to find. After 20 minutes of careful filtering, she detected it. Henry's biosignature was broadcasting from a subdermal tracker that all Earth military personnel carried. The signal placed him in the maximum security prison complex in the Northern Hemisphere at Section 7 on Level 42. Jake looked at the prison schematics that intelligence had provided. The complex had 6 shield generators that created overlapping protective fields. Automated defense turrets covered every approach angle. Guard rotations happened every 4 hours with over 500 Zethrain soldiers on duty at any time. Direct assault would get them killed within minutes. They needed a different approach. Sergeant Chris Bailey suggested something crazy that might actually work. The Council was arrogant and believed themselves superior to humans. They would never expect humans to voluntarily walk into their prison. What if 2 team members pretended to be refugees seeking asylum from Earth? The Council would jump at the chance to use human defectors for propaganda purposes. Once inside the prison, those 2 people could disable security from within, while the rest of the team created a distraction. Jake considered the plan for several minutes. It was risky and required perfect timing, but it might be their only chance. He approved the operation and chose Chris and Amy to be the ones who went inside. Both of them changed into civilian clothes and prepared a small shuttle. Hidden in their mouths were nanite injectors disguised as dental fillings. The nanites were microscopic machines programmed to eat through energy field projectors. The shuttle left the shadow and flew toward Nexus Prime, broadcasting on open channels. Chris and Amy claimed to be human refugees who disagreed with Earth's decision to fight the Council. They wanted asylum and were willing to provide information about human military capabilities. The Council authorities responded immediately and granted landing clearance. This was exactly the kind of propaganda victory they wanted. The shuttle touched down at the main spaceport, and Chris and Amy were met by a squad of Zethrain soldiers. The aliens towered over the humans and carried heavy weapons. They placed restraints on Chris and Amy and confiscated their visible possessions. The guards searched them thoroughly, but never thought to check dental work for hidden technology. Within an hour, the 2 humans were transported to the prison complex for processing and interrogation. Chris and Amy were separated and placed in holding cells 3 levels below where Henry was being kept. The cells were small cubes with force field doors and constant camera surveillance. They waited patiently for the next phase of the plan to begin. Up in orbit, Jake maneuvered the shadow closer to the planet using the traffic patterns of cargo haulers as cover. Helen activated a specialized device that sent out electromagnetic pulses tuned specifically to disrupt Zethrain communication frequencies. The pulse hit Nexus Prime like an invisible wave. Communication systems across the planet started experiencing interference. The prison's network detected unusual activity, but the guards assumed it was normal solar radiation or equipment malfunction. That gave Chris the opening he needed. He activated the nanite injector in his mouth and spit the microscopic machines onto his palm. The nanites immediately began consuming the energy field projector in his cell door. Within 3 minutes, the force field flickered and died. Chris stepped out of his cell into an empty corridor. The cameras were still working, but he moved quickly to avoid being seen. He reached the security station on his level and used close combat training to disable the 2 guards before they could raise an alarm. Amy did the same thing in her cell and joined Chris at the security station. They accessed the prison's computer network and uploaded a virus that Helen had designed specifically for Zethrain systems. The virus spread through the network like wildfire. Security cameras began showing recorded footage instead of live feeds. Door locks started opening randomly. Communication systems went completely offline. Within minutes, the entire prison complex descended into chaos. Alarms blared and emergency lights activated. Guards ran through corridors trying to figure out what was happening. Nobody suspected that 2 humans were responsible for the breakdown. Chris and Amy recovered their equipment from the armory and changed into stolen Zethrain guard uniforms. The armor was too large, but in the confusion nobody looked closely. They made their way up through the levels toward Section 7. Other guards passed them in the corridors but assumed they were responding to the emergency. The disguises worked perfectly until they reached level 40. A Zethrain officer stopped them and demanded to know their assignment. Amy responded in the Zethrain language that Helen had taught her, but her accent was wrong. The officer's eyes narrowed with suspicion, and he reached for his communication device. Chris reacted instantly and struck the officer in the throat with a precise blow that collapsed his windpipe. The officer fell without making a sound, but the confrontation had cost them precious seconds. They ran the rest of the way to level 42. Behind them, shouts echoed through the corridors as more guards discovered their fallen officer. Chris and Amy reached Henry's cell, and Amy used the access code she had stolen to drop the force field. Henry stood waiting with a smile on his weathered face. He had heard the commotion and knew his people had come for him. The three of them moved quickly back through the prison, but the element of surprise was gone. Zethrain warriors converged on their position from multiple directions. A firefight erupted in the main corridor with energy beams and bullets flying in both directions. Chris laid down, suppressing fire with his rifle, while Amy armed the explosive compounds she had synthesized from her hidden dental chemicals. The explosion tore through the wall and created a new exit into the prison's maintenance tunnels. They ran through the dark tunnels with emergency lighting casting strange shadows. Henry kept pace despite his age because adrenaline and survival instinct overrode physical limitations. Behind them, dozens of Zethrain soldiers gave chase. Their heavy boots thundered on the metal floors, and their weapons lit up the darkness with deadly energy beams. One beam passed so close to Henry that he felt the heat on his neck. Jake brought the shadow screaming down through the atmosphere with shields glowing from friction and defensive fire. Helen broadcast false identification codes that confused the automated defense systems for a few seconds. Those seconds were enough to reach the prison complex. The shadow came to a hovering stop above the roof and extended its boarding ramp. The extraction team emerged onto the roof through a maintenance hatch. Plasma fire erupted from the pursuing guards. Chris was hit in the shoulder and spun around but kept moving forward. Amy tossed her last explosive charge back through the hatch to slow down their pursuers. The explosion bought them 5 seconds. They used those seconds to sprint across the roof toward the waiting ship. Henry jumped first and caught the boarding ramp. Chris went next despite his wounded shoulder. Amy was last, and a plasma beam grazed her leg as she leaped. Jake didn't wait for the ramp to retract before accelerating straight up. The sudden movement threw everyone against the walls, but nobody complained. Getting away was more important than comfort. Nexus Prime's orbital defenses locked onto the shadow. Energy beams lanced up from the surface, and satellites in orbit began tracking the small human vessel. Jake threw the ship into evasive maneuvers that tested the limits of the inertial dampeners. The shadow barrel rolled and twisted through a storm of defensive fire. One beam hit the port side and scorched the hull plating. Alarms screamed throughout the ship. Helen worked frantically at the navigation console, calculating a quantum slip course. Her fingers flew across the controls while she called out numbers. They needed to reach minimum safe distance before they could jump, or the gravity well would tear them apart. Jake pushed the engines past their safety limits. The ship shuddered and groaned but kept accelerating. Another explosion rocked the shadow. Warning lights filled the cockpit like angry stars. Jake compensated for the damage and kept flying. Helen counted down from 10. Each second felt like an hour. At 5 seconds, a massive energy beam passed so close that the sensors registered hull temperature spiking to dangerous levels. At 3 seconds, an explosion from a proximity mine buffeted the ship sideways. At 0 seconds, space tore open in front of them. The familiar blue-white tunnel of quantum slip drive enveloped the shadow. The defensive fire and pursuing ships fell away into normal space as the human vessel entered faster than light travel. They had made it out. Admiral Patricia Cole stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching the tactical display with the calm focus of someone who had prepared for this moment their entire life. Around her, 56 other human warships held formation in the darkness of space near Arcturus Junction. Every crew was at battle stations. Every weapon system was charged and ready. Every captain knew they were about to face an enemy force almost 4 times their size. The junction was a natural choke point where multiple hyperspace routes came together like rivers flowing into a lake. Any fleet traveling from Council space toward Earth had to pass through this area. Patricia had positioned her ships in a defensive formation that would force the Council armada to fight through them, rather than simply bypassing toward their target. It was the perfect place for an ambush if you were willing to take the risks. 3 days had passed since they arrived and fortified their position. The crews used that time to run combat drills and check every system twice. Nobody talked much about the odds. Everyone knew that many of them would not survive the next few hours. But everyone also knew that Earth depended on them holding this line. If the Council Armada reached Earth, then millions of civilians would be at risk. The sensor officer called out from his station. Multiple hyperspace signatures were appearing at bearing 270 at a distance of 50,000 kilometers. The Council Armada was arriving exactly when intelligence had predicted. Patricia felt her heartbeat increase slightly, but her hands remained steady. This was it. Everything came down to the next few hours. The Council ships emerged from hyperspace in a massive display of force. 200 warships appeared in formation, ranging from small destroyers to enormous dreadnoughts that made the largest human vessels look tiny. They arranged themselves in a layered sphere that was designed to bring maximum firepower to bear, while protecting the larger capital ships in the center. It was a classic Council battle formation that had won countless wars over thousands of years. Chancellor Vex's face appeared on the main communication screen. The insectoid leader transmitted from his flagship called the Eternal Dominion. His mandibles clicked in what Patricia had learned was the Krill equivalent of laughter. He told Patricia that she could not win this fight. He offered her one chance to surrender and promised that her crews would be treated with mercy if they stood down immediately. Patricia looked at the alien leader with cold eyes and replied in a steady voice. She reminded Vex that the Council had attacked human ships first. They had taken prisoners and declared war on Earth. They had shown no mercy when they broadcast their intentions to enslave humanity. The time for mercy had passed. This was his one chance to turn around and go home. Otherwise, the Council was about to learn what human warfare really looked like. Vex's laughter grew louder. He called Patricia's words primitive arrogance. He pointed out that his 200 ships vastly outnumbered her tiny fleet. He boasted that Council weapons and shields were superior. He said this would be a slaughter, and blamed Patricia for the deaths of her crews. Then he gave the order for his fleet to advance. Patricia turned to her weapons officer and gave a single command. All ships were to execute Attack Pattern Alpha and launch everything. What happened next shocked the Council commanders so badly that several of them froze in disbelief instead of reacting properly. Every human ship launched its entire payload of missiles simultaneously. Over 4,000 missiles streaked across the gap between the two fleets. Their engines burned at maximum acceleration, creating trails of fire in the darkness. Behind the missiles, the railguns began firing. Streams of hypersonic projectiles followed the missiles downrange. The human fleet was throwing everything it had at the enemy in one massive opening salvo. The Council point defense systems activated and began shooting down incoming missiles. Energy beams and small cannons tracked and destroyed hundreds of missiles in the first few seconds. But there were too many coming too fast. The Council had never fought an enemy that used this kind of overwhelming firepower. Their doctrine emphasized precision strikes, not mass bombardment. Their defenses were designed to stop careful attacks, not waves of missiles that numbered in the thousands. The first missiles reached the outer screen of Council destroyers. Nuclear warheads detonated in brilliant flashes of light. The Council captains were stunned. Nuclear weapons had been banned in space warfare for over 10,000 years. The Council considered them barbaric and uncivilized. But humans had never agreed to those restrictions, and in space nuclear weapons were devastatingly effective. The gamma radiation and electromagnetic pulses from the nuclear explosions washed over Council shields that were designed to resist energy beams, not the raw thermal and kinetic energy of nuclear detonations. 3 destroyers simply disintegrated in the initial barrage. 5 more were crippled with collapsed shields and breached hulls. The elegant Council formation began to waver as damaged ships fell out of position. Patricia did not give them time to recover or regroup. She ordered all ships to advance at maximum speed. The human fleet accelerated directly toward the Council Armada. This violated every principle of Council warfare where fleets maintained distance and traded long-range fire. But human ships were faster, and in close combat their railguns became exponentially more effective. The gap closed rapidly. Admiral Zorn, commanding the Council fleet, realized too late that his forces had trained for the wrong kind of war. They had prepared for battles that followed tradition and honor. They expected careful maneuvering and measured exchanges of fire. They had not prepared for an enemy that fought like cornered animals. The humans were accepting damage to inflict greater damage. They were trading casualties for tactical advantage. They were completely unconcerned with fighting honorably. The distance closed to 10,000 kilometers, and Patricia gave another order. Every ship opened fire with their railguns at point-blank range in space combat terms. Depleted uranium slugs traveling at significant fractions of light speed punched through Council shields and armor like paper. The physics were simple and brutal. Mass times velocity equals destruction. At these speeds, even small projectiles carried enough kinetic energy to tear ships apart. A Council cruiser broke in half as railgun fire shattered its spine. Another lost all power when a slug tore through its engineering section. A third started spinning out of control with its maneuvering systems destroyed. The perfect Council formation dissolved into chaos as ships tried to avoid their damaged comrades, while simultaneously fighting off the attacking humans. Captain Ryan, Foster commanding the heavy cruiser, Valiant saw that the Council flagship was concentrating fire on the Defiant. 20 enemy ships were focusing their energy weapons on Patricia's vessel. The Defiant's shields were holding but barely. In another minute they would collapse and the human flagship would be destroyed. Ryan made a decision without hesitation. He turned the Valiant directly into the path of the incoming fire. The Council energy beams hit the Valiant instead of the Defiant. The heavy cruiser's shields collapsed almost immediately. The hull began to glow red from the intense heat. Ryan ordered his crew to abandon ship. Every escape pod launched within seconds. Ryan stayed at his controls and set a collision course for the Eternal Dominion. The dying Valiant accelerated toward the Council flagship. The Valiant struck the Eternal Dominion at tremendous speed. The collision tore through the Council flagship's shields and ripped a massive wound in its hull. Atmosphere vented into space in huge plumes. The mighty vessel that carried Chancellor Vex listed out of formation with entire sections exposed to vacuum. The Eternal Dominion was not destroyed, but it was crippled and no longer combat effective. Patricia honored Ryan's sacrifice by pressing the attack harder. The human fleet drove deep into the Council formation like wolves among sheep. They used their speed advantage to avoid getting surrounded. They targeted engines and weapon systems to cripple rather than destroy when possible. Each crippled ship became an obstacle that other Council vessels had to maneuver around. The battle raged for 6 brutal hours. Space filled with debris and energy weapons fire and the occasional flash of nuclear detonations. Human ships took heavy damage but kept fighting. The destroyer Plymouth lost its entire forward section, but continued firing with its remaining weapons. The frigate Manchester had its engines destroyed and drifted powerless, but its crew kept shooting until their ammunition ran out. Commander Lisa Grant led a squadron of fast attack ships on a daring maneuver. She took her ships around the edge of the battle and penetrated deep into the Council rear area. There she found 3 ammunition haulers that supplied the Council fleet. Lisa's squadron destroyed all 3 haulers with missile strikes. The resulting explosions were enormous and caught 8 nearby Council ships in the blast. That was the turning point. Admiral Zorn watched his fleet falling apart. He had started with 200 ships and superior technology. Now over half his vessels were destroyed or crippled. His flagship was barely functional. His supply line was gone, and the humans showed no signs of stopping despite their own heavy losses. They fought with a ferocity and determination that Zorn had never encountered in 10,000 years of Council military history. 3 days after the Battle of Arcturus Junction, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and the mood in the chamber was completely different from their previous meeting. Fear had replaced the arrogance that once filled the room. Half the Council members attended through holographic projection, because they were too afraid to gather in person, now that humanity had proven it could strike anywhere. Chancellor Vex attended in person, but his body still bore medical braces from the injuries he sustained when his flagship was rammed. The battle reports made for grim reading. 200 ships had been sent to subjugate Earth. Only 97 returned. The rest were destroyed or too damaged to make the journey home. It was the worst military defeat the Council had suffered in over 2,000 years. And the enemy that inflicted this defeat was a species that had barely been in space for a century. The implications terrified every Council member, but the military defeat was only the beginning of their problems. General Marcus Webb had taken the offensive with Phase 3 of humanity's response. Human strike forces were hitting Council military installations across their territory. The attacks were surgical and devastating. Intelligence that Henry had gathered during his captivity, combined with data from captured Council databases, gave humanity perfect targeting information. Every strike hit exactly where it would hurt the most. At the Krell shipyards, human commandos planted antimatter charges that destroyed 2 dreadnoughts under construction. The loss set back Council naval production by 3 years, At the Zethrain ammunition depot on Fortress Station, a team of human soldiers stole stockpiles of advanced weapons and then destroyed what they could not carry. At the Saurix training facility, a precision missile strike destroyed the officer academy, creating a leadership vacuum that would take a decade to fill. Each strike followed the same pattern. Fast insertion by stealth ships, overwhelming force applied at the point of attack, quick extraction before reinforcements arrived, minimal civilian casualties but maximum military damage. The Council military was structured for large-scale battles, not guerrilla warfare. They had no effective defense against these hit-and-run tactics. Every day brought news of another installation destroyed or damaged. The Council chamber erupted in arguments. Some members wanted to continue the war and commit even more resources to crush humanity. Others pointed out that continuing would only lead to more losses. The Krill Collective, which had lost the most ships at Arcturus Junction, was particularly vocal about seeking peace. Several smaller species that contributed ships to the Council military were threatening to withdraw their support entirely. Chancellor Vex listened to the arguments and felt the weight of 10,000 years of tradition pressing down on him. The Galactic Council had ruled this sector of space for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to face a real challenge. They had grown comfortable in their superiority, and now a young species had shattered that comfort by refusing to be conquered. On Earth, President Hayes met with his military advisors in the Situation Room. Intelligence Director Lisa Monroe presented reports on the Council's internal divisions. The enemy alliance was fracturing. Several species were questioning whether the war was worth continuing. Morale among Council military forces had collapsed after Arcturus Junction. The time was right to offer terms, but those terms had to be carefully crafted. Admiral Cole argued for demanding significant concessions. Territory, reparations, and permanent military restrictions on the Council. General Webb agreed. They had the Council on the defensive and should press every advantage. But Henry Brooks offered a different perspective. The old captain had returned from his debriefing sessions and sat quietly in the corner until everyone else had spoken. Henry said they had proven humanity could fight. Now they needed to prove humanity could make peace. The Council's mistake had been seeing humans as primitives. If Earth acted like conquerors now, then they would simply confirm the Council's worst fears. The goal should not be to humiliate the Council, but to force them to accept humanity as equals. A peace built on mutual respect would last longer than one built on resentment. The debate continued for hours, but eventually a consensus emerged. Earth would offer peace terms that were firm but not punishing. Complete recognition of human sovereignty and rights under galactic law. Return of all prisoners taken during the conflict. Establishment of formal diplomatic relations. No reparations demanded, and as a gesture of goodwill, humanity would share the specifications for quantum slip drives with the Council. It was a calculated risk giving away a technological advantage, but it would demonstrate that humans wanted partnership, not domination. President Hayes approved the proposal and assigned Henry to deliver the terms personally. The old captain would return to the Council chambers, but this time as Earth's official ambassador. The Shadow would carry him back to Nexus Prime under full diplomatic credentials. The Council had already agreed to grant safe passage after several days of tense negotiations. Henry walked into the Council chambers for the second time, but everything had changed. The Council members no longer sat on elevated platforms looking down on visitors. Instead, they had arranged seating in a circle as a symbolic gesture of equality. Chancellor Vex greeted Henry with respectful clicks of his mandibles instead of mockery. The other Council members watched the human ambassador with caution and something that might have been respect. Vex spoke first and informed Henry that the Council had reviewed Earth's proposed terms. After much debate and discussion, they were prepared to accept. The Galactic Council formally recognized humanity as a sovereign species with all rights and privileges. All human prisoners would be released immediately. Formal embassies would be established. The territorial disputes that had sparked the conflict would be resolved in humanity's favor. Henry nodded slowly and thanked the Council for their wisdom in choosing peace. But he was not finished speaking. He stepped forward into the center of the circle and looked around at each Council member in turn. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight that made even the most powerful aliens listen carefully. He told them they had made a mistake at their first meeting. They had looked at an old man and assumed they saw weakness. They had not understood what it meant that humanity sent their elderly to positions of importance. Humans did not discard their elders. They valued the wisdom that came from decades of experience. They put their oldest and most knowledgeable people in charge of critical situations because those people had survived long enough to learn from countless mistakes. Henry explained that everything the Council had seen as weakness was actually strength. The Council mocked human impatience, but that impatience drove innovation. They criticized human weapons as crude, but those weapons were devastatingly effective. They called human tactics barbaric, but those tactics won battles. They thought humans fought without honor, but humans fought to survive, and survival was the highest honor. He reminded them that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting to survive on a planet that tried to kill them at every turn. Ice ages and plagues and natural disasters and predators and wars among themselves. Every challenge that should have wiped them out only made them stronger. That was what evolution meant for humans. Adapt or die, and humans were very good at adapting. Henry's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He said that humanity had offered them war and delivered it. 200 ships reduced to less than half. Installations destroyed across Council space. Military capabilities severely degraded. But humanity was also offering them peace and partnership, the choice of which offer to accept had always been the Council's to make. He explained that humans and the Council could accomplish great things together if they worked as partners instead of enemies. The Council had 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge and experience. Humanity had fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. Together they could explore uncharted space and solve problems that neither could handle alone. But partnership required mutual respect, and the Council had failed to show that respect initially. Henry looked directly at Chancellor Vex and spoke with absolute clarity. If the Council ever threatened Earth again, the response would be swift and total. Humanity would not show mercy a second time. They would not accept subjugation or domination. They would fight with everything they had until either they won or they went extinct. And making humanity extinct would cost the Council far more than they could afford to pay. But if the Council chose partnership, then humanity would be a loyal and valuable ally. Earth would share technology and knowledge. Human ships would help defend Council space from external threats. Human innovation would benefit all species in the alliance. The future could be bright if both sides chose cooperation over conflict. Chancellor Vex stood from his seat, which was a gesture of great respect in Krill culture. He said that Henry's words carried wisdom that the Council had forgotten during their long dominance. They had become arrogant and believed their way was the only way. Humanity had taught them a painful lesson about the dangers of that arrogance. The Council chose partnership. They chose to learn from younger species rather than simply ruling over them.